a doctor is struck down by a powerful and mysterious illness.
Our biggest fear was, would he survive?
The violent and terrifying symptoms are relentless. Coming on without warning, they leave the man fighting for his life.
I thought, this is probably going to be the last time that I ever see him again.
Doctors face the most puzzling case of their careers and will need their patients' help if they're going to stop a silent killer. In the wealthy suburb of Prairie Village, Kansas, cardiologist Mike Farrar begins his new exercise program. But suddenly, something is terribly wrong with the doctor. He is overcome by excruciating stomach pains.
It was hot, and after I was done, I was nauseated. I vomited several times.
After several minutes, he musters enough strength to stumble back to his home.
Because I was so violently ill, I was concerned that I had something that was really an unusual illness. I got sick.
His wife, Deborah, also a doctor, is surprised by his sudden illness.
What happened?
He'd been just fine hours earlier. Even though Mike is still violently ill, he goes into work the next day.
I had missed more than a day of work for 10 years. My health had been perfect. I mean, I was 40 years old. I'd never been in the hospital, never had an operation.
But cardiologist Kent Barr, a doctor in Mike's group, can tell something is terribly wrong.
He was nauseated, vomiting, and running a temperature, and was really quite ill.
Mike, you're back.
Mike is sick all day at work, but refuses to go home.
I asked him that evening if I could take his call for him, and, you know, he's a tough guy and said, no, I'll take care of it.
Mike stays at work, but he is becoming increasingly concerned about the cause of his illness. He seeks out gastroenterologist Dr. Greg Barber and asks about his symptoms.
He told me that he thought it probably was just an intestinal fluid viral gastroenteritis that was garden variety, and if it persisted, then we might look into it.
People can present with the same disease in many varying ways. You can have a mild gastroenteritis or a severe gastroenteritis. I thought he was a little bit more on the severe side, but still within the realm of what I would expect would be consistent with some form of infectious gastroenteritis.
But Mike's illness quickly progresses.
I went home and ate with my family, and then I had torrential nausea and vomiting. I vomited as many times as 20 times an hour and vomited all night. I had explosive diarrhea. I had abdominal pain, which was really a relentless burning.
The next morning, Deborah races Mike to the hospital. What has invaded her husband's body and is quickly making his illness life-threatening? By the time Mike is admitted, he is dangerously ill and is feeling the effects of a high fever. Doctors begin to test Mike's blood and stool.
The first things that we did was really relatively routine in gastroenterology. We went ahead and cultured his stool, did a lot of cultures as far as his bodily fluids, including his blood, and waited for those results to come back in the hopes that we could start treatment immediately, get him better, get him home and back to work.
But something is troubling about Mike's sickness.
Generally, just when people have gastroenteritis or vomiting and diarrhea, they just aren't that sick. They're sick, but they get over it. But Mike was so ill that he could barely walk, barely talk, and he was very dehydrated.
Initial test results offer no clues as to what is attacking Mike's body.
Cultures didn't show anything unusual. They didn't show any white blood cells. They didn't show any bacteria.
About 6 weeks ago, and
How could Mike be so sick if his tests came back normal?
In the field of infectious disease or microbiology, we know we've identified only a very small proportion of the germs or the organisms that can cause disease. Very, very small number.
If he has a disease that doctors have never seen before, can they identify it and stop it before it kills him?
everybody was
Doctors turn to the person closest to him, his wife, for any clues about his illness.
She provided another point of view. She was someone who was an observer who could see what was going on, not only while he was in the hospital like I could, but she could also would be my eyes and ears at home.
okay.
Deborah tells them about a recent vacation.
You know, he just came back from Peru. It was about 5 weeks, I believe, from his trip.
I've been in an environment where he's in South America where there's different bugs down there.
Doctors find out that 7 weeks earlier, Mike and Deborah had gone to the Amazon with their son Tim and 40 other parents and students. It was the ultimate adventure. They visited Incan ruins and hiked up famous Machu Picchu. They tried to experience everything native.
He had eaten some things though, kind of that you might be suspicious in that regard. He ate some food off of the street and vendors.
I was thinking that he had some sort of tropical disease, either a infection, virus, bacteria, or maybe even parasite that maybe we just couldn't culture in a routine lab.
Could Mike's South American adventure be the cause of his illness? Could he be fighting a foreign and potentially lethal virus?
There wasn't a whole lot of clues, that we didn't have any data that we could rely on, and there really wasn't a good explanation of why he was so ill.
But even with the possibility that Mike has a tropical disease, shouldn't it still show up on his blood and stool tests? Mike's doctors begin to think his trip to Peru is not the cause of his illness.
My suspicion initially was that some organism that we just didn't have the technology to identify had triggered this illness.
I think for a physician in the modern age, where so many things can be explained, it becomes very frustrating because we're kind of used to that now. We can explain things much more in detail, even more so than a few decades ago.
Doctors fight Mike's mysterious illness with antibiotics, but despite their efforts, Mike's health is quickly deteriorating.
Look at the white cell count here.
I was hoping that somewhere along the line we're going to find the right magic bullet that was going to get him better.
How can doctors fight a disease they've never seen before?
To watch a colleague is sobering because, you know, you put yourself in their place. That could surely be me or someone else.
Mike's condition is growing worse by the minute. His elevated white blood count has now plummeted. The hospital staff and Deborah can see Mike is quickly deteriorating. But the source of his illness is still frustratingly out of reach.
They were working on one of their own. I mean, it's like working on a family member. You know, you absolutely follow every clue, you know, every single sign that you have that could take you to a resolution of the problem.
Mike's body begins to shut down.
Get that right away.
He was very dehydrated, weak, and he was even throwing up even then when I was talking to him.
The intensity of the pain was really excruciating.
Experienced doctors are puzzled by Mike's quick deterioration. Could a mysterious virus destroy Mike's body in less than a week? Can doctors come up with the needed answers to protect their patient and even themselves from a potential killer?
I need some doctors in here, stop.
In August 1995, a strange and powerful stomach virus has cardiologist Mike Farrar hanging on for his life. Doctors are baffled, but suspect his recent vacation could be the cause.
Occasionally you'll have a puzzling case, but usually those unusual cases gradually show improvement, and you don't get these sudden reversals in improvement despite continuing the therapy.
Doctors believed his illness might be linked to a recent vacation in Peru. Is it possible that something had incubated in his body and is now causing him to be so sick?
It can take weeks or months after a trip. And it usually actually happens to more commonly to people that are indigenous to the tropics. So travelers don't get it that often.
The first thing I think you'd want to know is, was there anyone else at home sick?
All right, doing okay?
Some of Mike's family and most of the people on the Amazon trip had traveler's diarrhea, but it lasted for short periods of time, and they had recovered weeks earlier.
You're the only one that...
Everybody else was fine. His wife was fine, the kids were fine, and nobody else on the trip was sick. That was a little odd. You would think if one person on the trip was so sick that the other people on the trip might also be sick.
Mike's friend and colleagues can see that Mike's mysterious illness is starting to get the best of him.
He looks surrendered, like I'm as sick as I can be and I'm not going to get any better. It was kind of a surrendered look.
Since doctors can't figure out what has quickly invaded Mike's body, there is no sure way to protect others from also being infected. They must inform the federal government there is a potential crisis in the hospital.
We actually called the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and asked what they thought with all of this history and all of these lab results. Hey, thanks.
While his doctors struggle to make a diagnosis, Mike is losing valuable time. His body has gone septic. Bacteria has invaded his bloodstream.
Okay, hang in there, you'll be just fine.
The way we put that together is that his intestinal lining was already bare from whatever the infection was our thinking, and therefore the bacteria were able to get into the bloodstream a lot easier.
Do you want me to... No.
To combat the rampant infection, doctors must put in a central line, which delivers fluids and antibiotics straight into his bloodstream.
My wife, who was a physician, was there and apparently offered to one of the nurses that she would be happy to put the central line in.
Deborah's skills as a physician could be a valuable tool.
Well, Deborah's a very bright lady. She was an oncologist trained in internal medicine. Each of us had probably somewhere near 9 years postgraduate training in internal medicine.
Deborah's attentiveness is comforting to Mike, even though the illness is putting intense pressure on a relationship that is already strained.
It was really a terrible time in my life, a terrible time, both physically and psychologically.
As the time wore on, naturally, he became a little bit depressed.
Does Mike have the will to overcome his sickness? Whatever the outcome, Deborah will be by his side. Even with emotional support from family and friends, Mike's health is getting worse. He floats in and out of consciousness.
At about shift change, when all these people were coming into work, I remember looking out there and thinking, you know, these people are coming into work today, and they're going to go home tonight, and they're going to come in tomorrow. I believed that when those people came back to work the next morning, I was going to be dead.
We didn't have a reason why this happened. We didn't have an infection. We didn't have, and it was such an unusually severe, extreme infection or process that was going on that we just couldn't tell what was causing it.
Doctors finally get information about Mike's case from the Center for Disease Control. But is it too late?
They thought that it could possibly be something called typhoid fever.
400 cases of typhoid fever are diagnosed in the U.S. each year. It is not contagious, but can be deadly if not treated. But Mike had been given the proper care. Why was he getting worse?
Everybody.
Doctors fear even the CDC might have misjudged this potent virus.
It didn't really present like typhoid fever. He was very ill, but he had more gastrointestinal symptoms than I would have expected.
Mike's friend and colleague, Roma Toms, is aware of Mike's struggles and comes to visit him.
When I saw him, it stopped me cold, because when I looked at his face, I thought, he's going to die. And I had a rush of cold chills. I was upset when I saw him, and I didn't want him to know that.
I know, it's painful.
As I left the room, one of his partners was outside, and I looked at him and I said, he's going to die, isn't he? And he said, no, now. Don't worry, everything's going to be okay. He just picked up something when he was out of the country. We'll take care of him.
And his doctor was right.
Gradually he got better, the dehydration got better, the antibiotics we thought were working, his fever abated.
But doctors still aren't sure if Mike is recovering from a bout of typhoid fever.
It appeared to be going away, that for some reason we weren't able to identify the specific germ or organism or disease that had caused it.
Could a tropical virus attack suddenly and then vanish just as quickly? After 7 days in the hospital, Deborah can finally take her husband home. But his hospitalization has taken its toll. Mike now struggles to do simple things, like crossing the street.
Traffic was heavy. I had to run across to be ahead of the cars. And I got about halfway across the road and I couldn't run. I had to stop and walk, and I could barely get across in time. It was frightening. It made it clear to me how seriously ill I was. I was so weak that I couldn't even run 50 feet across the road.
The same night Mike is released, he has an appetite for the first time in a week. On his deathbed just a few days ago, Mike now eats dinner with his family.
Look at that.
Tim liked to cook, and in fact, he always wanted to be a chef. And so he made a spaghetti dinner and served it to all of us, and it was fine. It tasted good.
But soon after the meal, Mike's illness returns.
That evening, I became violently ill again with the same symptoms: abdominal pain, a torrential nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration.
Mike is barely conscious when Deborah rushes him back to the emergency room.
He went home, ate a meal, and within a couple of hours was back in with exactly the same symptoms that he had presented with the week before. And we were pretty baffled.
Mike knows he is in another fight for his life.
The second time I was admitted to the hospital, I was thinking that there was really something seriously wrong. It was a really miserable illness.
Mike's relapse comes as a blow to his friends and colleagues.
It was a devastating process, devastating for everybody in the hospital who knew him and everybody who'd ever been working with him.
Deborah and the hospital staff wonder why Mike's mysterious illness suddenly returned just hours after he left the hospital.
He was just on the brink. It was just like standing at the edge of a cliff, you know, and nobody knew when he'd fall off, but everyone knew he would fall.
Despite their best efforts, a potential killer has stopped doctors cold in their tracks. The invader still lingers, waiting to strike again. In a small Kansas City suburb, an unknown virus is attacking Dr. Mike Farrar. He was discharged from the hospital after his health had improved, but just hours after going home, his symptoms returned.
I don't think he was experiencing any unusual exposures or anything that might reinfect him or make him sick all over again. There just wasn't a good explanation at all.
For the discomfort, okay?
Mike wouldn't have relapsed with typhoid fever, so doctors are back to square one. A diagnosis.
To not be able to explain why somebody's so sick in near death and repeatedly so was very frustrating and anxiety provoking.
Well, it was fine for 2 or 3 days.
Doctors hope Mike's wife, Deborah, can help them solve the puzzle.
I was trying very much to encourage her to help me and help us to figure out what was the cause of the changes in his condition, the deterioration that would seem to occur, and was hoping that she would provide us with some insight.
What was the difference between the environment in the hospital and the environment in the home that was causing him to be ill?
Could there be a fungus or bacteria in the Farrar home? The doctors are determined to solve the most puzzling case of their careers.
I picked up my textbook of infectious disease, sat down, and read through the entire section on gastroenteritis and diseases of the bowel, stomach, and small bowel, looking for a disease that I might have missed.
They also begin more aggressive medical testing.
We launched into additional tests that were involved in examination of his colon by colonoscopy, and we examined his stomach to check for signs of infection.
We obtained a small bowel follow-through. That's where he drinks barium and the 25 feet of the small intestine are visualized. We're looking for things such as swelling of the intestinal lining. Are there things that would surprise us, such as an infection down further in the intestinal tract?
Even with so many question marks, Mike is still able to maintain a positive attitude.
He did a great job of dealing with these issues and said, okay, what's the next thing we have to do? Never tried to micromanage the workup.
Doctors are frustrated that they can't help their patient and their friend.
What about insects? Were you stomach?
When your patient's not getting better and you think you've thought of everything, you always wonder, is there something else I can be doing for my patient?
There's a certain sense of you're doing everything that you can do. But with his case, we're doing everything we thought we were doing correctly, but it just wasn't helping.
While Mike is good at telling doctors about his physical ailments, he fails to mention another factor that may be affecting his health, his marital problems.
Maybe you're playing with a deck that doesn't have all the cards in it, therefore you're never going to come to the proper answer.
I really didn't feel that it was anybody else's business, about how my personal life was deteriorating.
When Mike returned from the Amazon, he found out his wife was coping with unhappiness by abusing prescription drugs. Deborah was not satisfied with being a stay-at-home mom after giving up her medical practice so Mike could follow his career.
You and me. I want a divorce.
Mike knew the relationship wasn't working.
I was going through a divorce, And I had just asked my wife for a divorce about a month before that.
The first one is typhoid.
Deborah's depression and their pending divorce was weighing heavily on Mike's mind. Was it possible that a bad relationship was causing Mike to have health problems? Could Deborah be to blame for Mike's violent illness? The results of the medical tests come back, and doctors find something puzzling.
The lining of the intestines was totally flat. Normally it's supposed to look like shrubs, of course at the microscopic level. The fact that it was totally flat was consistent with one of two things, tropical sprue or sprue.
At last, doctors have finally found a diagnosis. Tropical sprue is a stomach illness that Mike would have picked up in Peru and would make him intolerant of certain foods. That would explain why Mike became violently ill after he ate dinner at home.
He had eaten a spaghetti dinner. So then you think, well, was it something he ate? Was it an allergic reaction to the food?
Doctors think Mike is allergic to the gluten in wheat. Mike is placed on a strict gluten-free diet and begins to improve. After another week in the hospital, Mike can finally go home. But he is now so weak, he must take meals in his bed.
Our biggest fear, to be honest with you, was would he survive? He was seriously ill, was losing a great deal of weight. Nourishment was a problem.
Deborah and the kids help out with Mike's care.
She would serve my meals at home and help me out with just daily activities because I was getting weaker and just loss of strength.
Even though Mike recovered on his diet, he refuses to believe the doctors have the correct diagnosis. How could he get a food allergy so suddenly?
I'd never had any food sensitivity, so I just couldn't believe that that was what was wrong with me.
Mike tests his theories by eating slices of bread.
It didn't make any things any worse, so I didn't believe the diagnosis.
If the diet isn't the answer, then the cause of Mike's illness is still unknown. That means, without warning, it could suddenly strike again. But for now, Mike is improving, and a week after he has been home, he is finally well enough to eat dinner in front of the television. Mike gets to spend some much-needed time with his 3 children.
The kids knew that I was sick. They knew I wasn't around. I was in the hospital a lot.
The kids know something is terribly wrong with their parents' relationship.
It was also complicated by the fact that they knew we were going through a divorce, and I think they were having a lot of psychological problems related to that.
The Farrars can't even have one normal family dinner. It ends abruptly. The mysterious symptoms are back.
I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew that I would have nausea and vomiting that would last about 24 hours, that I would have diarrhea that would last about 24 to 48 hours, that I would have this horrendous abdominal burning that would last a few hours.
Mike is admitted to the hospital for a 3rd time.
Nobody really knew what was going on. He was admitted, and he would seem to be getting better, in a few days after being treated, being here. And then after he'd go back home, it would all start again. And we really thought that it was just a matter of time, that there would just be so many admissions and then he wouldn't recuperate or he couldn't rally on one of these admissions.
Dr. Terrence Coleman tries one more time to crack the mystery of Mike's terrible illness. He hopes Deborah can give him valuable insight into why Mike is getting so sick at home.
I felt a pretty close relationship with Mike at this point, having worked with him many years, and just met his wife on 1 or 2 occasions before that, but clearly she felt like she was part of the team. She was going to be someone who could maybe provide us with some ideas and some new thoughts that we hadn't thought of before. There were really no holds barred at that point. We were talking about everything.
Had spaghetti and meatballs.
Doctors attribute Mike's newest flare-up to non-compliance of his diet.
Do you see that?
Mike may have tempted fate by eating too many slices of bread.
When he got home, he was eating some wheat or some barley or some other grains that were really not part of his diet, and that in the hospital we had better control over what he actually ate.
I went down the path of thinking, well, he had eaten more at home, perhaps a higher fat meal, or there was something about the volume of food that he'd eaten that triggered these reactions.
Mike's body has now deteriorated.
Deborah just wheeled Mike into the department in a wheelchair, and he looked devastated, emaciated. He was so incredibly thin and weak.
You have this yo-yo effect where he's getting better and then he's getting worse and he's getting better and he's getting worse. But on balance, overall he's deteriorating. And each time he comes in the hospital, it seems as though we're losing ground rather than gaining ground in the overall treatment of his illness.
Doctors think they have the answer to Mike's illness, but little do they know the potential killer still lurks and silently waits to strike him down again. In a Kansas City hospital, Dr. Mike Farrar has just been admitted for a third time because of a mysterious illness attacking his gastrointestinal system.
Here for just temporary.
He eats a meal on that weekend, and within a very brief period of time after eating a meal becomes acutely ill with the same symptoms and returns to the hospital again. The conclusion that we all made at that time was that it appeared that ingestion of food triggered these symptoms.
But is the answer far more complicated? Mike's intestines are now so damaged, he's not allowed to eat.
He was losing weight. As a matter of fact, he was losing so much weight and he was losing so many proteins in his body that we had to send him home on artificial nutrition through his veins.
We basically tell him not to eat until whatever had triggered this bowel injury healed.
Once you're on that and you get over the hump and the antibiotics and the vitamins and the withdrawal of the wheat products, we were hoping that he would again regrow his intestinal lining and would be able to eat and would maintain his own nutrition.
Medicine can do just so much, and then they send the patient home, to do as much as they can do at home or to make more room in the hospital. The hospital can't hold patients that are not going to improve.
Mike is allowed to go home again to try a recovery. But on his first day back, he is astounded that he weighs the same as his teenage son.
Man, how you doing? Your shoes and everything?
The end of the third illness, I weighed about 120 pounds. There was one day where I walked in, looked at myself in the mirror, and it just struck me how ill I was and how much weight I'd lost and how weak I was. And I really thought I was going to die.
But Deborah is determined to nurse him back to health at home.
She truly was concerned about my illness and my recovery, and was very helpful with all of the different aspects of my care, including the IV feeding.
Not everyone thinks Deborah's intentions are pure. Since Mike's illness is so unexplainable, people around him begin to speculate.
I would go home, I would get sick within a short period of time, violently ill. Then I would go back to the hospital and I would get better. And some of my friends were concerned that perhaps I was being poisoned. Even though I was having a terrible relationship with my wife and I wanted a divorce, I just could not believe that she would do something of that nature.
But perhaps the mysterious illness has left for good, as Mike is on the road to a full recovery just a week after being home. He is even able to return to his cardiology practice.
I was tired at the end of the day. I didn't take any call at night, and I just did limited things like read electrocardiograms, read echocardiograms, do treadmill tests, things like that weren't particularly physically stressful.
Mike is returning to a sense of normalcy, but once again, it won't last. In his bathroom, he makes a startling discovery in his wife's things.
I found in a drawer a bag that contained about a dozen packets of castor bean seeds, 3 empty vials of potassium chloride, and a vial of a chemotherapy drug, adriamycin. I could not imagine why she had castor beans. It said all over the packages that these were deadly poisonous. The adriamycin, which is a cancer chemotherapy agent, is certainly something that can make people very ill.
Why would Deborah have these items? And of all things, castor beans.
I did confront her and ask her what it was for, and she said that the castor beans were for some sort of school project for Tim, our son.
Mike is suspicious of Deborah's answers.
She had no interest in any sort of botany or gardening or anything like that, and certainly it didn't explain the potassium in the adriamycin, and she had no explanation for that.
With Deborah's weak explanations and the recent turmoil in their marriage, was it possible she was thinking the unthinkable?
If this is something that she was going to use to commit suicide with, I thought, that's really unusual.
Deborah, once a stable mother and a respected physician, begins to act strangely.
What?
Mike fears Deborah is spiraling out of control when he finds her with a knife.
My wife was drinking heavily. She threatened suicide. I was very concerned about her well-being and the psychological well-being of the children. So I called her psychiatrist, who recommended that I have her transferred to a mental health facility.
The police arrive to take Deborah to the hospital.
There's no need to yell about this. We need to talk about this in 5 minutes.
After 17 years of marriage, Mike and Deborah's relationship has taken a final dramatic turn for the worse.
Why don't you and I go upstairs?
Deborah is admitted to a psychiatric clinic and will be treated for a chemical imbalance.
You're gonna have to tell me to my face it.
The following day, Mike is disturbed by thoughts of his wife's mental health and the package of castor beans. But what was the link between the two?
I looked up castor beans in a textbook of medicine that I had at the house, and there were 2 paragraphs on this. It said they were highly toxic. When I read that, the hair on the back of my neck went up. It really was awful. I mean, when I read that, I was just chilled.
Mike's head is spinning. He thinks he has just uncovered the answers he and so many other doctors have been looking for. Cardiologist Mike Farrar is slowly recovering from a debilitating and mysterious stomach ailment. He would suddenly become ill at home, but slowly recover in the hospital. It was a pattern that brought him to the brink of death several times. But a chance discovery changes everything. Packets of castor beans. Why would Deborah have them?
It turns out that castor beans contain ricin, which is a highly toxic poison, and ricin can cause a life-threatening illness that's characterized by severe nausea and vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea, fevers, chills, and all the types of symptoms that I had. So when I read that, the hair on the back of my neck went up. I thought, my God, she has been poisoning me with these packets.
With his doctors trying everything to come up with a diagnosis for Mike's mysterious illness, is it possible that the patient has finally diagnosed himself? Mike is now convinced he is a victim of ricin poisoning.
It's the 3rd most toxic substance known to man. It's twice as toxic as cobra venom.
Is Mike jumping to conclusions too quickly? How would Deborah know about ricin poisoning, especially when it's so rare? Ricin was the poison of choice in early 20th century mystery novels, and it most recently resurfaced in 2004. In February of that year, ricin made front-page headlines when it was mailed to the Senate Majority Leader's office, causing the evacuation and decontamination of 50 Senate employees. Mike decides to share his research with Dr. Nick Szilagyi.
I told him of the marital problems that I had been having with my wife, and I gave him those articles, kind of gave him a brief synopsis of those articles, and told him that based on this, I was convinced that she had been poisoning me.
I said, Mike, this is very possible what's going on, and it fit more so than anything else just because of his yo-yo effect. He was getting better in the hospital, going home, getting sick again, and so it actually did fit more precisely than anything else we could offer him.
After 4 days at the hospital, Deborah is released. She is unaware that Mike has been doing research on castor beans and ricin poisoning.
I did not call the police. I didn't really think that they would believe me. I thought that they would think it was just some paranoid husband who's mad at his wife who he wants to divorce, and he's trying to smear her name.
Rather than confront Deborah about the poisoning, he decides it's better if he just moves out.
What are you doing here?
I thought, I'm just going to leave it at this. I'm going to avoid my ex-wife. I'm not going to eat anything that she gives me.
A few days later, Mike runs into Deborah at their son's soccer game.
She offered me a cup of cappuccino that she said Tim had prepared and that he wanted me to drink it. And she said, be a good father and drink it. And I did not touch it.
Mike knows it would have been useless to bring the cup to the police.
If you go to the police and you say, my wife's poisoning me with ricin, here's a cup of it, please analyze it, it really would seem unbelievable. And for all they know, it could have been me that put the ricin in, so it wouldn't prove anything.
Is Mike simply reaching for answers to his frustrating and miserable illness? If he is right, it will be difficult for him to prove.
We can't just draw a blood test here at North Kansas City Hospital and send it to the lab and have it checked out for ricin. It's something that's only done in a few select centers.
Later that night, Mike gets a page from his home number. It is Deborah. She has been drinking and her speech is slurred.
Deborah, what's going on?
They talk briefly, but Deborah soon hangs up on Mike. Mike gets another phone call, but this one is not from his wife.
About 12:30, one of the neighbors called me and said that my house was on fire, and I needed to get over there right away.
When firefighters arrive, Deborah and 10-year-old Lisa Farrar have escaped the burning blaze. When Mike reaches his home, his first concern is for his children.
When I got to the house fire, it was an absolute inferno. I ran up to the first police officer and asked him where my children were. He took me over to a police car, and my wife and my daughter were sitting in the police car, and he said the other two are still in the house. At that point, I screamed. I turned around, yelled at my wife, "What have you done now?" And then turned around and looked at the fire and just stared at it. And I knew within seconds that there was no chance that they would be alive.
Mike's son, Tim, and his daughter, Kelly, die in the fire. Have Mike's accusations gone too far? He can't prove he is even being poisoned, and now he's making serious implications that his wife has killed their two children. For 3 days, fire officials investigate. Firefighters conclude the fire was started by a substantial amount of accelerant. It was no accident.
I spent a lot of time talking to the police and talking to the district attorney. And during this entire period, I kept losing weight and generally felt poorly. Then I started having more low-grade fevers and chills. And then after that, I started having night sweats.
If Mike isn't around Deborah but is still having mysterious medical symptoms, he must have made a terrible mistake. Was he wrong about everything?
He had this persistent fever, and one of the things that can cause persistent fevers of unknown origin is infectious endocarditis.
This time, doctors can diagnose him. Mike has a bacterial growth on one of the valves of the heart. But is this a new illness or an effect of ricin poisoning? Because of Mike's earlier suspicions, doctors take his blood to send it for testing at a specialized lab. They hope to find if his body has built up antibodies to ricin.
You can't just do a broad smattering of tests and say, everyone who shows up at the hospital with diarrhea is going to get tested for poisoning. It's just so rare.
In the meantime, Mike has surgery to fix his weak heart valve.
It was a real ironic situation. You got a cardiologist who spends his whole life studying people's hearts, dealing with things like infections in the heart, and yet this is what he had. He had an infection of his heart valves.
As Mike slowly recovers from his long illness, the results of his lab tests come back. Mike does have ricin antibodies in his blood. He had been poisoned.
I had been married to her for almost 17 years. While I certainly wanted to be divorced from her, and for a variety of reasons that I thought were valid, I never, ever would have thought that she would do something that was this evil, that was this mean.
Mike immediately gets shock number 2. Police investigating the house fire announce they believe Deborah set it.
Never once did it cross my mind that my children would be at risk. The one thing that I was confident of, even though my wife had tried to kill me, I was confident that she would never harm the children.
Deborah Green is arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder, and aggravated arson. She is currently serving a 40-year sentence in a correctional facility in Kansas. How would Deborah ever come up with something like ricin poisoning?
She was an avid reader, and there was an Agatha Christie series of short stories that were written in 1929. And there was a story called The House of the Lurking Death, which was about ricin poisoning. I will always be angry with her, no question about it. But she's where she needs to be. She's separated from society, which is what needed to have done.
For him, there was, although tremendous suffering, in the long run, he's a healthy man. He's back to being at least physiologically intact. Who knows what the emotional impact of his illness is or will be, and certainly he's got many ghosts that he'll have to deal with the rest of his life.
The doctor turned patient spent more than 6 months in and out of a hospital fighting to survive. But it was Mike Farrar that diagnosed his condition and ultimately saved his own life. Today, Mike is completely recovered from the attack on his health, but his children are never far from his mind.
I would give anything to have my children back. I mean, I would have given my life to have my children back. And if I'd have been in that house that night, I suspect that I would have died with the children, trying to get to them. I do count myself fortunate to be alive and in good health now.